Well, hello. In that case, please let me introduce myself. I'm Mary Ann Spina. I am retired pastoral associate from Holy Cross in Deerfield. Been retired for the last 4.5 years. Loving retirement. And thank you for asking me to do this program for you. I just want to announce to everybody, this is my first Zoom experience as a presenter. So if it gets screwed up, it's my fault. I'll just own that right off the top. Our topic today is spirituality. And so I thought we would look at a few things. Now, let's see if I can. This is a term that's being tossed around quite a bit in society today. And it's used more, people will say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. What does that mean? Okay, so it's become sort of a generic term, and it's more of a therapeutic self-interest term. Christians used to understand spirituality as the inner life, more on the private side. And more recently, it's become much more fashionable to separate it, as I said, from a religious tradition, really referring to a person's own self-growth, inner journey, self-development. It be in the cultural aspect, it's become all about me and how I relate to a greater being, how I relate to the universe. It's generally me and the cosmos. And it's more about meeting my own personal needs and self-interest than any kind of faith-based thing. We're not going to look at that. We're going to look at Christian spirituality. And I had asked Tom to ask people if they would come up with a definition of what spirituality is. And I'm just curious, Judy or Arlo, do you have a definition of spirituality, or what do you think it is?
Well, you're hitting me broadside here. I didn't get that message from.
Okay. Well, then I don't want to put you on the spot. No, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but it would be helpful to think about that for next week. If you were going to write a definition of spirituality, maybe you'll get some ideas from my presentation this morning that would help you clarify.
I would think, just off the top of my head, I would think it would be being attuned to God throughout your entire life.
Okay. Pretty good definition. Judy, do you have anything?
That pretty much covers it.
Okay. So some on the screen, I'm sharing some definitions. One way to look at it is the lens through which we view our lives. It could also be the expression of what is most sacred, or for me personally, it's more about a recognition of the extraordinary in the ordinary. There's a great quote, I love this quote, from Teilhard de Chardin. By reason of creation and even more incarnation, nothing is profane for those who know how to see. Other comments about spirituality, other definitions: looking for the patterns of God's movement in our lives, discerning God's call to us, finding or giving meaning to life and encountering the God within our lives. Another definition would be looking for the beauty and the sacredness of the now of our lives. Another definition is an expression of what is most sacred about life, or what connects us to the universe. It is viewing life's meaning as greater than we can know our limited senses of taste, touch, sound, sight, and smell. Joan Chittister, Roman Catholic nun, says spirituality is about coming to the consciousness of the sacred. Life is not an exercise to be endured. It's a mystery to be unfolded. I love that quote.
I have read a lot of Joan Chittister's books, and I love her writing.
Isn't she wonderful?
Yes.
And so one of the things I like about her writing is it's very practical, very earth. Anybody can understand it.
Right.
On the other end of the spectrum is Karl Rahner, a great theologian. In light of Christian faith, the very commonness of everyday things harbors the eternal marvel and silent mystery of God and grace. And for his writing, that's a pretty clear definition. So again, some other things. I've already said some of these. Perhaps the last one here on the bottom, Christian spirituality includes the various ways in which we live out our baptismal promises through prayer and action. It's a way of approaching God in prayer that fosters a way of living out the gospel. Now, I would never have written that, but it is a good definition, and it is one of the things we're going to look at. It is about living out our baptismal promises, because of course in baptism we receive Jesus as our Lord, we accept Jesus as our Lord. And what does that mean? It's not just about a me and Jesus relationship. It's a me and Jesus relationship, a me and God relationship, but how does that inform how I relate to others? What does that do to the rest of my relationship? How does that inform how I live out the rest of my life? So that's what we're talking about in spirituality. Christian spirituality is not, unlike generic spirituality, which is more, okay, it's me and the cosmos and the rest of the world can sort of, it's there, but this is a private personal thing. That's not true of Christian spirituality. Christian spirituality is much more my relationship with God. How does it inform how I am with others? So I thought we'd take a brief look today, especially on the history of spirituality, because there's been a big shift in how we look at things. The word spirituality is first mentioned in the 4th century by St. Jerome. And he's saying that the spirit we receive in baptism, we have to continue to maintain that spirit. We have to pay attention to that spirit. We always have to have the spirit enlivening us and directing us. So that was the first mention of the word. That's not to say that beforehand people weren't spiritual. They might not, they obviously didn't use that word. But the Hebrew scriptures, the older tradition was, the goal was to know God. And that's a very interesting word in Hebrew. The word in Hebrew is yada. And it is the same word that if you're familiar with the book of Genesis, where it says, after the creation of Adam in the second story of creation, God puts a sleep on Adam and removes and takes from his side a piece of Adam and builds up Eve. And then it says, and Adam knew his wife Eve. Now we all know what that means. That word is yada. So we are to know God in the same way that Adam knew Eve, the old biblical knowing. And you're completely immersed in the person, you know all about them. That was the goal of the Hebrew scriptures, to come to know God that intimately. And the Hebrews believe that we come to know God in 3 ways: the experience of the human condition, in community and relationships, and by attempting to do God's will. So you'll see, as we look at the history of spirituality, that we sort of lost that for a while, and then we're coming back to that more and more in terms of Christian spirituality. So this is a very broad history of spirituality, basically looking at 3 different eras. The first era is all the Hebrew, we were talking about the roots of Christianity, up to 70, which of course is the destruction of the temple, when the Jews who were following Christ basically start moving out to the broader world. So the earlier view of how we come to know God was a very Semitic attitude, and it was a very ghetto attitude in terms of, we've got God and nobody else does. I'm going to leave off the Christians for a moment. If you think about the ancient Hebrews, it was sort of, our God is the only God, and we've got him, and God is for us, and the rest of you have worship these idols and false gods, and you don't have the real God. We've got God. For the early Christians, and I'm talking about basically before 70, before 100, really, it should probably be, these people had personal experience of Jesus. They didn't need to wonder who Jesus was. What does Jesus mean for me? They knew the guy personally. That's a whole different experience than we have. Very, very different. Then, and I'm going to break this down a little bit. These are the broad strokes. That after 70, there's this break, the temple's destroyed, and Christianity moves beyond Judaism and moves into the broader world, which of course is the Greek and Roman world. And everything, how they viewed the world was influenced by those perspectives. And there was also particularly early church, I'm talking about the first 1,000 years, heresies really drove things because they were trying to work out who exactly was, once the people who knew Jesus personally had passed on, and the people who followed only had what the others had told them, and those stories get handed on, and we all know how stories get handed on. Things change, things adapt, we're in a different context. So the emphasis is going to be more on the divinity of Christ, and we'll look at this in more detail. That goes up to basically Vatican II. And the movement of Vatican II really had a profound influence, not only on the Roman Catholic Church, but on Christianity in general. It really becomes a reinvigorating, looking at things in a different way. And post Vatican II, there's much more emphasis on the third world, on minority communities, on the underserved. And it really is a return to the earlier biblical model. So if you think about, step outside of spirituality for a moment, and just think about how we looked at the Bible, post-Vatican II, there's a tremendous resurgence of biblical study, going back to the original sources, looking at what the meaning was in the original context. So where the goal of the Hebrews was to know God, the post-Vatican, in the biblical sense, to know God, yada, that intimately. Vatican II, the goal of the New Testament is to know God in Jesus Christ. And again, that intimately. Okay, let me go back just a moment. So one of the things we're focused on the second era and the third era, the second era just for a few minutes. Some of these heresies that really informed what was going on. So in the 3rd century, Arius, who's a bishop of a Christian presbyter, he's in Egypt, and he claimed, now again, this is in the 3rd century, so we're talking, Arius lived 256 to 336, obviously did not know Jesus personally. And his view becomes Jesus was just a superior being, but not divine. Well, that was pretty profound, and the Council of Ephesus in 325 condemns this. So what happens when councils condemn something, the emphasis keeps moving back and forth. I always thought it would be an interesting study to do the development of Christianity through the heresies alone, because what you end up having is like two sides of a ping pong board, and it moves from one end, and then when that heresy is condemned, it flies to the other side to give emphasis. So one of the things that I think of, not that it's a heresy, but I'm thinking about when something is emphasized, something else is diminished in emphasis. So the Reformation, the idea that the old line used to be, post Luther, the Protestants got the Bible, and the Catholics, the Roman Catholics, got the Eucharist. Now that's a really broad distinction, but it's sort of where the emphasis went, and that sort of informed things. So the same thing with the earlier era too. These heresies are always pushing things to different extremes. There was also in the 4th century, the Edict of Constantine that makes Christianity the state religion legal. This has great influence on how we image God also. It's Christianity is no longer the ghetto minority religion. It becomes the religion of the emperor. Well, that changes how you view, it changes your point of view if you're on the bottom or you're on the top. And so things come into practice that really have more to do with the emperor and royalty. So for example, genuflecting, bowing in front of the king. Well, that's something you did in front of the king, and it becomes something that the church started doing because that was where the emphasis went. There's great influence from Greek thought also. The Greeks, the Plato's philosophy of the perfect, the ideal, promotes the idea, this was an emphasis also, that the other world, the next world, is going to be the perfect one, and this world is bad. There's always this dichotomy, this contrast. So again, this emphasis that the other world is better, the other world is perfect, all the good is there, all the bad stuff is here on earth. And the Christians, who, of course, until probably the middle of the 20th century, are basically the poor. They see God as other and heaven as better than the lives they were having. Well, that kind of changes in the mid 20th century, where, and again, I'm talking the context of the United States particularly, life improves, and we start to see, this life is not so bad. This world is not so bad. And so the emphasis goes more towards this world. And then, as I said, post-Vatican II, things really change. The emphasis of the church is the people of God. And again, this return to the older tradition of looking for God in the everyday, to get to know God, not just to know about God, to get to know Jesus, not just about Jesus. So what I put together is sort of this is a very long chart. So looking at if you took the ping pong net as the two sides, the transcendent versus the incarnational, and I'm not saying one is not right and the other is wrong. It's a both and, but it's where the emphasis goes in terms of spirituality and as you look at this and think about this, I would encourage you to think about, okay, not that it's right or wrong, but which side are you more drawn to? Or you might be drawn to something on one side in one spot and something on the other. So it just sort of helps you think about how you view spirituality. In the transcendent model, which would be the sort of what we've had in the history of Christianity post 70 up to Vatican II, the divinity was emphasized. God is seen as other, and biblical quote to as high as the heavens are above the earth, so high above the ways of man are the ways of God. It is very future focused. So it's the next life, what's coming in the next world. And it would be more traditional. The incarnational model, humanity is emphasized. I'm talking about the humanity of Jesus is what is emphasized. God is our brother. Jesus is our brother. He's like us in all things except sin. It's much more focused on the here and now, would be the more modern. In terms of thought, the transcendent model is much more rationalistic. The incarnational model is much more holistic. So schools of philosophy, catechisms. I grew up with the Baltimore Catechism. I don't, some of you might not know, I'm a Roman Catholic. So I grew up with the old Baltimore Catechism, which was a question and answer. I still know that. I can't believe I still know this. The first question in the Baltimore Catechism, who made me? And the answer is God made me. God made me to know, love, and serve him in this world and be happy with him in the next. That was the first question. So it's very organized. And the goal was intellect, about knowing about God. In the incarnational model, it's much more holistic, looking at the body, mind, and spirit all as a unity, not just separate, like, okay, God's, the soul is my mind and that's it. No, I'm a whole being, a whole entity. The goal is to know God and to know myself. Another way to look at the transcendent and incarnational split is the moralistic versus personistic. So the transcendent model is much more about principles, rules, thou shalt not, lists, laws. The personistic, more the dignity of the person is emphasized, more self-direction. So it's not, I have to come to my relationship with God and be willing to stand in the presence of God and be judged on that. So this would be one way to look at the difference. In the moralistic transcendent, the thou shalt not, the old model was standing before St. Peter with the book open, and it was almost a checklist. Okay, here's the checklist for Marianne, and there's all the good deeds, and here's a list of all the sins, and which is going to outweigh. It's sort of that mentality. The personistic approach is more, am I willing to struggle and try to find, be informed by the laws and the word of God and the commandments, but am I willing to stand before God and have a dialogue with God to explain how I saw things, how I understand things. So it's more goal directed. I think this one's easier to understand in terms of transcendent and incarnational. In terms of devotions, in the transcendent model, devotion, it's about forms of prayer, but for example, novenas, saying certain prayers. I always laugh. This is not very spiritual, but it's true. The rosary is a wonderful prayer. It's not particularly a devotion that I don't use it a whole lot in my own personal life until I'm on an airplane and there's turbulence. And okay, so this is, as I said, it's not one or the other. Here's where I fly back into the transcendent devotional. I pray the rosary on an airplane. This is really a terrible rationale because I can say more Hail Marys faster than any other prayer I know. It's really ridiculous, but it does part of what the rosary is supposed to do. It sort of calms you down and gets you into a spot where you can talk to God. Unfortunately, my talking to God at that point is just as fast as I possibly can. While I'm being honest, the transcendent, the penchant for the extraordinary. So, always looking for the miracles and again, not that it's what motivates you. So some of you may know that I've led travel trips in groups of people, and we've done several of the certainly the Holy Land, which I absolutely love, but we've done Lourdes and we've done Fatima, a couple other places, and some of the devotional places. So for example, Lourdes didn't move me at all, just didn't move me. But and I kind of look at those as like, I don't know that I really need that for my own spirituality. But when we went to Fatima, I'm not quite sure what it was, but for me personally, that was definitely someplace I felt a presence there. I felt a spirit there. It really moved me. And that's not usually what I would be attracted to, but that one did. But some of the others, I'm like, you see all the tchotchkes that they're selling, and it kind of ruined it for me. As opposed to the incarnational model, which is as opposed to the devotions, it's more focused towards the liturgy and the scriptures. So it's more about public worship, where the devotional is more about private, me and God devotions. One of the things we saw again for the Roman Church, the switch from Latin to English, in the incarnational model, the homily becomes very important, because the homily is supposed to take the word of God and help people integrate it into their own lives. How do we then live this out? When you let's put ourselves back into the context of when we were all still in church physically. how do we leave this building and carry that message from the homily out into the world? That's what the homily is supposed to do, to help you understand how to move out into the broader world. And it was a view, a Eucharist as a fellowship meal, as opposed to this, private devotion of I'm receiving God and the rest of you can all just sort of disappear. So it would be more the Transcendent, looking at another way, is a more closed model. The incarnational is more open. So for the Transcendent model, we have the faith. How do we hand it on? As a nice little box, here it is. Here's all the things we believe. Now, my child or my grandchild can have it. You should know the faith, know how to explain it, know how to preach it to other people. I'm more of a hierarchical structure, and the one true church, particularly, again, so from a Roman Catholic perspective, we are the one true church. In the incarnational model, everybody's on a journey of faith. I have a faith. Yes, there are precepts and tenets of that faith that I have that I can hand on, but I'm also still on my own personal journey of developing that faith. It's not a box that's finished and wrapped up. It's still developing. And the idea that everybody is seeking discernment. Everybody is on this journey. We don't have all the answers. Although sometimes we'd all like to have all the answers, and sometimes we think we have all the answers, but we don't. It's much more developmental. So another way to look at this, well, hang on a second. Let me just stop there. Are there any questions that anybody wants to ask so far, or comments? This is a little awkward since I'm not used to this Zoom thing.
I have a comment.
Yes.
It seems like as you describe the incarnational version, this is where the younger people today are leaning.
Yes. And it really is where the churches are leaning, for the most part. For the most part. Again, it's not a right or wrong. It's where the emphasis is fall. All of this is true, and all of this is valuable. The rosary, to go back to my little thing about the airplane, the rosary is a wonderful prayer. Now, I use it sort of in a weird way, not the best, but it's all good. So just look at the last, the closed and open. There are things that we believe that we want to hand on. It's this ping pong table, where the emphasis tends to go from one side to the other, and it keeps going back and forth over long periods of time. So we haven't, in some of these we've seen lots of switch, and in others not so much. They're all good, but yeah, I think you're right, that the emphasis today is from the churches generally is more on the incarnational model. Anybody else?
I grew up in Cleveland, which is a highly Catholic city, but not being Catholic. My best friend though was, and I used to go because she went to public school. She had to go to catechism.
Oh yeah.
Every week. And most of the time I went with her, and I think I knew as much as she did. But one of my questions was to her why she knelt before she went into the pew. She had no idea. So I asked that when we were in catechism with her, and I guess I learned more. She was there because she had to be, and I was there as an interloper, but I learned a lot, and it was interesting. Anyway.
Anybody else? I'm not sure how many people are on, so it might just be us at this point. I'm not sure. So the emphasis has gone from, for example, knowing the catechism, and we've come to this not having all the answers, but being able to live out what I believe is what's important. So for example, in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, if you live according to my teachings, then you will come to know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You have to live it out, is what the emphasis is now. So I put together a little bit. This is how we talked about things then and now. And again, I'm looking at basically pre 20th century, mid 20th century, pre-Vatican II to post-Vatican II. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to be sending out, I'm sorry, I forgot to say this earlier. I'm going to be sending out a handout, which will have some of this stuff for you. I'm going to send it to Mary, and then you'll be able to, it'll either be emailed to you or it'll be somewhere where you can click on it and get it. I'm not quite sure how this is going to work yet, but we're working on that. So, you know, we looked at it as rules and obligations. Now the emphasis is more on how do we look at life? The emphasis was previously on the law, and now it's more on the spirit and the spirit that animates my life. You know, when I was growing up, there was a lot of talk about preparing for heaven or hell. You have to admit, we don't hear that a whole lot anymore. It's more on how do we integrate and become a whole person here in this world to prepare us for the next. Spirituality used to be about discipline, just obey the rules. Now we talk about, you know, why we do things. So Judy, your comment about why do we genuflect? Why do you genuflect? What's that all about? You should understand the why. It's not just here's the rule, do it, and don't have a clue of why you're doing it. A bigger difference, I think, is the idea previously prayers were to God, and now prayer is more as a communication with God. Mm-hmm. The implication there is prayers to God, I can just rattle them off and here they are, Lord. Now if it's communication with, communication is a two-way street. That means there has to be some silence, and I have to listen to what God says. That was not so much the emphasis previously. We looked at healing as getting rid of a problem. How do you solve it? You know, God, I have a tumor, you know, make it go away. I'm gonna say a novena that I'm healed. Healing being get rid of this thing, whatever it is. Now it's more of a, now, not that people don't still do that, but it's that the emphasis is more on, okay, we can pray. I have a tumor. I have a skin tumor. I'm going to pray to God. I want to pray that God removes it. Yeah, but also a realization that maybe the answer is you will be healed, but you'll be healed in your spirit, that you'll be able to accept that this is what's going to happen in your life, not necessarily that it's going to go away. The emphasis used to be on church attendance. Now it's more about, you know, from a Roman Catholic perspective, the question used to be, when do I have to be at Mass that it still counts? And the answer was, you had to be present from the gospel until till communion. And if you missed any of that part, if you came late and you came to Mass after the reading of the gospel, you did not get a check mark. You did not get credit for you know, in the big book of St. Peter, you missed Mass that Sunday because you weren't there for the required amount of time. That was a mentality. And every once in a while, you still see that. Now it's more about participation. It's not what's the minimum I can be there. I'm supposed to be there to participate with the community and to be present for the whole of the Eucharist. So it's a different mindset. It's not about checking things off. The spiritual previous way we talked about spirituality, and this is some of the more generic cultural, what we talked about earlier, sort of how the culture has co-opted this word. It's about personal salvation. It's almost you know, what has God done for me lately? It's me and God, and the rest of the world can go to hell in a handbasket, but I'm good with God. Now we're looking more at spirituality as discipleship. How do I have this relationship with God, and how does it inform how I live out my life? So it was previously it was more church oriented, otherworldly emphasis. Now today the focus is more on Christ oriented and emphasizing, as I said, when you leave a service, what difference does it make in your life? Are you changing your behaviors because you believe in Jesus Christ? When you go out into the everyday world, have your actions changed? So the way we talked about it before was the Greek philosophy, more of a body-mind split. And today we talk about it more from a holistic body-mind-spirit unity. Previously, spirituality was much more stoic. Emotions weren't even part of spirituality, really, the way we talked about it previously. But now we look at, no, that's part of who we are. We have to include that. Here's a big difference. The view of celibacy and virginity as a way to God. Again, not that it is a way to God, but it's not the only way. And that, for a long period of time, that was sort of seen as the better way to approach God. I was pure, I was holy, I was a virgin, I dedicated my life to God. There's nothing wrong with that. But what about the rest of the world? We were kind of, the priests and the nuns, the religious, were sort of above everybody else, better than everybody else, more spiritual than everybody else. Now we look at more as marriage is an avenue to God also, equally valid. Again, not better or worse, but equally valid, that also is included in the emphasis. It is just as holy a path to God. In the older way we looked at spirituality, religion was a set of attitudes or behaviors pertaining to the sacred. Now we talk about faith as meaning-seeking behaviors. We're looking, how are we supposed to act because we have this belief? Faith, spirituality was more propositional, doctrinal. Now it's more imaginative, speculative, again, influencing your behavior. We talked about explaining who God is, how the world came to be, the existence of good and evil. Now we talk more about a reaction to mystery, to wonder, to grace, to discovery. Again, not that it's either or, it's both and. It's just, it's a spotlight moving back and forth. It was a spirituality, the ideal, as opposed to the spirituality of the real. And in the old days, we talked more about giving things up. So if you think about Lent, since we're just coming, we just had Easter, we just came out of the Lenten season. I'm thinking going back like to the 50s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. The question was, what are you giving up for Lent? What are you giving up for Lent? You gave up something. You gave up, if you were a kid, you gave up candy, you gave up chocolate, you gave up cartoons, whatever. And that was okay. That was okay, because it is a spiritual, it is a way of focusing our minds and our hearts on something else. So instead of being focused on where's my Hershey bar, I'm going to give that up and try to focus my mind more on God. But now the emphasis is more on, what are you doing for Lent? What are you doing for social justice? What are we doing to help others? Again, they're both good, they're both valid, but different. So sort of the emphasis shifted from sacrifice to service. Gotta look at my clock so I don't. So this is the only two images that I could come up, sort of the altar of sacrifice, which is a good thing, and through love serve one another, also a good thing. It's just where the emphasis falls.
I think it's hard to get the feeling of spirituality when we're not in person.
Yeah.
I mean, we read the Bible every morning and we do all these things, but it's not the same as when you're in the sanctuary and you're feeling the spirituality, I guess, of being there and feeling that.
Interesting that you should say that, Judy, because that's at least what I'm hearing, is that being in the community informs your own sense of spirituality. Is that right? That's what I'm hearing. which to me is, again, the spotlight is more, it's not just I can go to church and pray and the rest of you, if you show up, fine, but I really, it doesn't matter. It's that the emphasis is more on being together, being with the community is important also.
Yes.
So that spotlight shift has influenced you also.
Right. And even though we do read our scripture every morning and we talk about it, but it's not the same as being in community.
Right.
And
Right.
I really miss that part.
I have to say, even doing the Zoom thing, it's not the same as being in the room with all of you and seeing everybody's facial reactions and, getting some feedback and being able to, I'm glad that we can at least talk this way. It's certainly better than just being locked in the house by myself, but it's not the same.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So, the way the Pre-Vatican II model of spiritual development was, I had a faith, I had beliefs that impacted my life. My faith informed how I looked at things, and that colored how I viewed my experience. The current model, which was developed by a guy called Broom from Boston College in about I don't know, he put this together in the I think the early 70s, I'm not quite sure, early or late 70s, that we start with experience. Our experience leads to insight. Our insight leads us to change our behavior. That's our life. And that leads us to faith. And this really is the story of the ancient Israelites, Hebrews. If you think about, for example, the Exodus, they're a piddly little community that's enslaved in Egypt. And they managed to get out of Egypt. However that happened, they look back on it and figure out, wow, we're nothing and we escaped from the greatest power in the world. God must have helped us. It's the only explanation, because we're not powerful enough to do it on our own. We're not powerful enough to split the Red Sea. God did it. And that informs their life. So if God freed us, we have to have a relationship with God. And so that informs their faith. It's basically how the Bible came to be. So spirituality is a way of seeing our life, our experiences, our stories. The Emmaus story, which was in the A cycle, would be the reading for the day, but it's not. I just want to do a little bit. Y'all know the Emmaus story. Post the crucifixion, post the events of Easter, post the resurrection. The disciples are leaving. There's two of them, so it's not just me and Jesus. It's already a community, because when Jesus joins, there's three. And they're recalling what happened. It's on the first day of the week, and they meet this stranger whom they don't recognize, and who asks them, what's going on? What are you talking about? And they tell him everything that's happened in the last period of time. And Jesus then starts to explain everything to them. He takes what they said and reinterprets it for them. And at the end, suddenly their eyes are opened and they see things in a new way. The Emmaus story is really a story of spirituality. It's about coming to see things in a new way. They have to have the right eyes. It's kind of like for those of you who remember the TV show Alan Funt and Candid Camera, the premise was catching people seeing what they expected rather than what was really there. And so the Jesus is sort of the person who is he shows them what was really there, not just on the surface what they expected to see. It's a very powerful story about that. There's another story about what's a blessing and what's a curse. I hope I remember this. It's been a long time since I've told this story. This is a Jewish story about a father and son who are living in a village, and the pogroms start, and the Cossacks are coming to attack their village. And the father and son pack up their meager belongings, take their little donkey, they flee from the village just in time, and they end up, they can't find any place else to stay, so they basically run towards the forest, and they end up sleeping in a field. It rains during the night. They build a little fire. It rains during the night. The fire gets put out. There's lightning and thunder. Their little donkey, who they didn't tether properly, is so scared by the lightning, it runs off. In the morning, the father and son wake up. They're in the field. They're muddy. They're soaking wet. The donkey's gone. They have basically nothing. And the son says, "You always talk about God, that God provides, and this is, everything's a blessing. Where's the blessing in this? This is more of a curse." And the father says, "No, well, what is a blessing and what's a curse? If we had stayed in the village, by the way, was burned during the night. The soldiers came in and slaughtered everybody, and is burned. If we had stayed in the village, we would have been slaughtered. So we had to leave everything. So what's a blessing and what's a curse? God gives, God takes away. Blessed be the name of God." And if the rain hadn't come and put out our fire, the soldiers might have seen our fire and they might have found us. So the rain, in fact, saved us. So what's a blessing? What's a curse? God gives, God takes away. Blessed be the name of God. And our donkey, yes, it's gone. But if the donkey had brayed during the night and the soldiers had heard it, they would have found us. So who's to say what's a blessing and what's a curse? God gives, God takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So that spirituality, the Father is able to see everything as a blessing, because he's able to look beyond what's just apparent. Takes even the curses of life and is able to change them into blessings. So as I said, one of my favorite quotes is, again, T.S. Eliot, "We had the experience but missed the meaning." Jack Shea was a Roman Catholic priest. We need to take time to unpack, review, reflect on our experiences and find their meaning. And that prayer is listening to life. So how do we do this? I'm going to see how much time I have left. And how do we take what's given in life and change it into gifts? We need to have faith in order to face what seems like a curse and look for a blessing. And they can become, if we learn how to look through eyes of faith. It's a big issue in Mark's gospel. I'm not going to go through all of these, but in Mark 12, people may look and yet not see, hear and not understand. That's spirituality, is becoming able to look and see, hear and understand. There's all kinds of, even in Mark's gospel, who do you say that I am? The disciples, Peter, James and John, had this great experience on the Mount of Transfiguration. They see Jesus transfigured. And when that experience is over, Jesus turns and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter gets it right. "You are the Lord." Jesus starts talking about, "Well, now I have to go to Jerusalem to suffer and die." And what's Peter's reaction? No, wrong. Nope, can't do that. That's not my definition of Messiah. So even though he had this great experience of seeing Jesus transfigured, he still doesn't really see it. He sees what he wants to see. No, it's not going to be that way. So the point of miracles is for spiritual insight, to see Jesus for who he really is, the suffering servant, the one who will release everything. At the end of Mark's gospel, all that's left are the wrappings at the first ending of Mark's gospel. And the message is that he's gone ahead of us to Galilee. So how do you read the signs? How do you read the signs of the empty wrapping? How do you read the signs of your own life? We can't have resurrection without death. We have to be constantly learning to see things more clearly. And so this is, I'm coming to my end here. The word for crisis is an interesting word. In Chinese, it means dangerous opportunity. The two characters together are the word crisis. In Greek, it's the point of judgment and decision. Judgment in Greece is not meaning, oh, it's good or bad. It's the moment where you're just stopped short and then you have to make a decision. And in Hebrew, the word mashbar means birthing stool. That's what a crisis is. It's the place of new life. So how do we turn blessings into curses? In the Old Testament, the story is Jacob wrestling with the angel. He takes hold of the angel, wrestles with it, raises it up. That's the Exodus, like the serpent in the book of Exodus, where Moses raises up the serpent in the desert, the image. You have to break it open. You have to tell the story, and you have to share it. In the New Testament, the parallel is the Eucharist. Oh, and here's a surprise. It's the same set of steps. You have to take hold of an experience. Jesus at the Last Supper takes the bread and wine. This is my body, this is my blood. He does it at the table at the Last Supper. He does it on the cross. This is my body. This is my blood poured out for you. It's raised up. At the table, he raises up the bread and wine. On the cross, he himself is raised up. At the table, he breaks the bread. On the cross, his body is broken. It's shared. He shares the bread and wine at the table. He pours out his life, his blood for others on the cross. This is what we're called to do in terms of our own spirituality. How do we take our life experiences, raise them up to God, offer them to God first, break them open, and share them with other people so we can help other people? We are called to be signs of resurrection in the world. That's what an Easter spirituality is. That's what we as Christians are called to do.